This memorial was built more than a half-century after the event it marks. And for the men it honors, time is running out.
Like 1,200 World War II veterans. We're not dying every month, not every week, every day.
Now, through a grassroots organization, a group of veterans from Kansas has an opportunity to relive the experience of 60 years earlier. Storming the beach in a hail of artillery.
You didn't know if the enemy was right there ready to shoot at you when you landed.
Terrorized by enemy aircraft.
You didn't know when the next one would be here.
And witnessing the devastation that ends the violence.
As far as our eye could see, it just evaporated.
These are the stories of 3 men, but they're echoed by thousands like them. The greatest generation on one last mission to see the memorial that honors their sacrifice. The World War II Memorial was built to honor the 16 million who served and the more than 400,000 who died during World War II. It features 56 pillars inscribed with each state and American territory as it was in 1945. 2 43-foot arches designating each theater of operation, Atlantic and Pacific. And the Freedom Wall, 4,048 stars, each star representing 100 Americans who died in the war. It took nearly 60 years for this memorial to be built. Now, sadly, the men and women it honors are fading away.
I understand that we're dying at a rate of over 1,200 a day. Hard for me to understand that. It's a time when you find out what homelessness is.
Lee Phelps is 85 years old, from Stockton, Kansas. It's been a while since he's looked at his photo album. His decorations.
Theater of the South Pacific. The 2 major invasions.
Pulled his uniform out of storage. There's a story behind each of the things he's kept. But it's been years since he's given them much thought. He will tomorrow. Lee Phelps will board a plane bound for Washington, D.C. to visit the monument dedicated to him and to the millions of other veterans like him.
They have been recognized by many in many ways previously, but nothing as enormous as this memorial. It's a real honor.
It's all possible through the efforts of a nationwide grassroots organization called Honor Flight, dedicated to honoring the men and women who fought during World War II.
What's fulfilling is that finally, after accomplishing so much and waiting so long, these veterans are getting the recognition they so long deserved.
To date, Honor Flight has flown over 17,000 veterans to visit the memorial. Funded solely through private donations, it costs the men nothing but time. Honor Flight operates out of 75 hubs in 35 states. This trip is out of Salina, Kansas, located in the central part of the state, smack in the middle of the country, the area where Lee Phelps calls home.
It's a wonderful gift, and it's a real tribute and a thanks to all the people who are sponsoring us, supporting us.
But Lee won't be making this trip alone. George Kugel will be there. And so will E.J. Novotny. And 100 other men, all veterans of World War II. And each knows this opportunity could be his last.
You think about that, the guys are laid to rest that wasn't able to see this, which would have been nice, you know what I mean?
In 1941, Lee Phelps was 18 years old and fresh out of high school, and was looking forward to the future.
Well, I started inquiring what it was going to cost to go to college, and I didn't have the finances. So I decided I would put it off a year and earn money and then start again.
Then, the unimaginable. The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor.
War broke out and changed our lives. I volunteered with a buddy of mine in December of 41.
Lee started in Chicago at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center.
2 days after they called me, and it was the 22nd of February. I can't forget that because it was 22 degrees and cold coming off the lake.
From Naval Boot Camp, Lee volunteered to put his experience in medicine to use and became a pharmacist's mate, 3rd class. Lee trained to care for the wounded, and he'll soon witness firsthand the true horrors of war on the front lines of the healers. It wasn't long before Lee was on a ship, steaming away from friendly shores and into dangerous waters. And by early 1945, he found himself just offshore of a then unknown island called Iwo Jima. A tiny speck of volcanic rock that would soon become unforgettable. 22,000 Japanese troops had positioned themselves deep within the island's caves and tunnels, hidden to U.S. forces as they came ashore. And Lee had a front row seat to the violence.
Those Japanese boys, they had a lot of practice up in those tunnels and their shelters that they had built. They could go here, there, and every place.
In the early days of the battle, the Japanese had U.S. troops on the ropes.
And they could hit a dime down on the beach by just lobbing those shells over.
The Japanese had targeted virtually every inch of Iwo, turning the island into a kill zone. In the first week of the battle, Americans suffered thousands of casualties.
They allowed you to get in so many yards in advancing on this area, and then they'd start lobbing those shells, and that was pretty nasty.
Soon after Lee's ship had unloaded her equipment and passengers, she was converted into a hospital ship.
We had a surgery room, had a sick bay, and then we had other areas of the ship which were for the minor injuries where we could take care of them.
And Lee would soon have his hands full. Day after day, stretchers lined the beach. His job, ferry onto the island and bring the wounded back to ship.
Everybody took turns of going in with a landing craft. And so you bring these boys back and you bring them aboard. And you care for them.
The trips to shore came more often than anyone would have thought. By battle's end, nearly 27,000 Americans would be either injured or killed, and Lee was left to pick up the broken pieces. Then, 5 days into the battle, in the midst of the chaos, a glimmer of hope.
The day the flag was raised, excuse me, get emotional here. We were able to go up at the wheelhouse and observe the flag being raised.
It would not only inspire troops on Iwo, but galvanize a nation and become an iconic image of the war. And Lee was an eyewitness.
And to us, it was a giant relief to see this occur, and yet here still were all of these Marines and other military personnel on the island fighting their way up the island. But at least that was a mark that they knew they were on the way to victory.
After 11 days on Iwo, Lee's ship was full, and she set sail for Guam. It was on this passage that Lee cared for an officer who would affect him profoundly. The name has faded from memory, but Lee will never forget the moment they shared.
The officer, in the days that we had him aboard and underway back to Guam, I became very close to him. We shared lots of prayer time, and as we were underway during the night, he told me, Lee, listen, I won't make it back. So, he said to me, he said, you know I'm a Catholic and you're a Protestant, but that doesn't make any difference right now. He said, I want you to take my rosary, just remember me. And I have that rosary this day. And he knew he wasn't going to make it. Well, he didn't. So we had burial at sea. It's something that people don't realize, and it's strange when you think about it, that you literally put them in this burial bag and they are prepared and they are taken to a gangplank and lowered off of that and buried at sea when you're underway. That's probably the most emotional time of all the time I served in the service.
But Lee's duties in the Pacific were far from over. Although he didn't know it at the time, his next assignment was Okinawa, where kamikazes were a ship's worst enemy. Now, nearly 65 years later, here in Salina, Kansas, just preparing for this trip has awakened memories, a recollection of good times and of bad. The stories of wartime all come flooding back. Today, 101 World War II veterans are packed and ready for this day-long trip to D.C. Many of these guys don't know each other. Just a bunch of men on a mission. Just like they were over 6 decades ago. They didn't know each other back then either, but all felt the same calling. One moment children, the next men preparing for war.
Everybody, all the younger people naturally were anxious to get the hell over there and whip their butts. Can I use a little profanity in this thing? Okay.
E.J. Novotny was a simple Kansas farm boy when the war broke out.
I was working for this friend of mine's on a farm. We were shocking feed, and his sister came out there to the field and said, "Leroy, you got your call today." Well, I lived in town, a little town of Zurich, and when I got home, I found that I got mine.
Like many young men of that era, E.J. wanted payback. He joined the Navy right out of high school in 1944. At 18, E.J. was young and naive, but he would age well beyond his years by the time this war was through with him. He would dodge bullets and bombs and deal with the constant terror of enemy aircraft. And as his ship steamed out of San Francisco to parts unknown, the uncertainty of the future was echoed throughout the vessel.
I remember going underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, and I sure hoped that I come back to be able to look at that thing again. This was 1944, and I wondered if I ever see my family and friends again.
By late 1944, the U.S. was full steam ahead in its island-hopping campaign that would ultimately take them to the doorstep of Japan. And Saipan was one of those islands, and E.J. Novotny was on his way there. E.J. was a CB, short for Construction Battalion.
U.S. Naval Construction Battalion, like the Army Engineers, only we were Navy.
But E.J. grew up in landlocked Kansas and had never been out on the open ocean.
You just were into oblivion. You didn't see any more buildings or nothing. You were just out at sea.
By the time E.J. found his sea legs, he was going ashore on Saipan. And even though U.S. troops had the island under control, untold numbers of Japanese insurgents lurked in the shadows and were a constant threat.
There were still some Japanese snipers there. I stood guard duty on occasion, and I could hear those Japanese talking out there. I was scared to death. If they ever come by, I don't know what I would have done. If there's 10 or 12 of them, and you may get a couple of them, but then they're going to get you before it's over with, you know.
As a CB, E.J. faced many of the same dangers as any infantryman.
You could have been under fire any time, that's true. There was one incident that we were out there, and I think some cocky Japanese pilot come by just to scare us, you know. He shot a couple of shots across, you know, everybody ran for cover. If there was any such thing behind a blade of a caterpillar or what have you, you know.
Saipan was an eye-opening experience for E.J. He was only on the island a short time when he got his next assignment, and he would soon be in some of the heaviest fighting in the war, Okinawa. Now, as E.J. and the rest of the guys make their way through Reagan National Airport, respect is in the air. Word has leaked out that these men are World War II veterans, and people in the terminal waiting for their flights start to cheer. It's a warm and unexpected welcome to the nation's capital. On their way to the memorial, it's a time of reflection and anticipation. The city they're in was transformed by World War II, The orders they followed over 60 years ago came from here. And now, they're going to see the ultimate tribute to their sacrifice.
Finally, after accomplishing so much and waiting so long, these veterans are getting the recognition they so long deserved.
But the occasion is bittersweet. Their thoughts turn to the men who were not so fortunate.
You think about all the people, all the men, your soldiers and sailors and what have you that were killed over there. That's still in your mind.
I'm just sorry that there are some of them that they're not going to get to see it.
George Kugel was born and raised in Great Bend, Kansas, not far from where he lives now. He was just out of high school when the war started. He was engaged to be married, but like most kids his age, he felt the need to join the fight.
It was something that we had never thought would ever happen to us, I guess. And when it did, why, it was something that everybody felt like we had to do something to get back with the Japanese.
A wartime draft was in full swing then, and at age 19, his number was quickly approaching.
I signed up before some of my friends did, and we knew the draft was coming, and I wanted to be in the Marine Corps, so that's the reason I joined before I got my draft papers.
George became a Marine, private first class.
It was 6 weeks that we had at boot camp.
Then, after initial combat training in New Zealand, it was time for George to get in on the fight. His first assignment was Saipan. George watched from the deck of his ship as the Navy softened up the island.
Of course, they shelled and bombed that island real good. And on D-Day, it was June 15th, 1944. The first wave went in.
A victory here would pierce Japan's inner circle and be a major pivot point towards Japanese defeat. But a victory would not come easy for U.S. troops. Saipan was heavily fortified. 31,000 Japanese troops had their heels dug in. The Americans quickly realized that the enemy would rather die than surrender. While George waited for his turn to go ashore, he got a horrifying glimpse of what was waiting for him. Marines, dead and dying.
After all of those men had gone in on D-Day, then we got some of the casualties aboard our ship, which wasn't a hospital ship. It just kind of hurt. Think about that.
George sat on ship as the first wave went ashore, then the second wave, all the while witnessing the carnage.
And it was the third day before I went ashore.
And after what he saw, George could taste the fear well up inside.
When we went in on Higgins' boats, we had to keep down because we didn't know if he was going into enemy fire or what.
George had trained for this day. He was prepared. He knew how to fire his rifle, how to take orders. But how does a man prepare to die?
All kinds of things ran through your mind. You didn't know what to really think.
George knew the score. The Japanese had taken their toll. Hundreds of American soldiers were cut down as they rushed ashore. And as his troop carrier hit the beach and the loading ramp fell in front of him, George's mind began to race.
You didn't know if the enemy was right there ready to shoot at you when you landed.
And then the moment came. George leapt from the Higgins boat, and a wave of relief rushed over him.
When we landed on the beach, our troops were already there. The front lines were already advanced far enough that there wasn't any fire in that area right there. I was lucky.
Those casualties George had seen earlier, they gave the ultimate sacrifice to win the ground so that he would be safe. For the next week, George stayed on alert, patrolling perimeters, ready to jump to the front if ordered. But the battle was won in little over 3 weeks' time. George's unit was ordered to the Americans' next objective, Tinian. George had just landed on Tinian and made camp when suddenly he blacked out, only to awaken weeks later.
Must have really had a high fever, and lasted for quite a while.
A Navy corpsman was at his side when he came to.
He said, "Boy, I didn't think we was going to save you."
George was taken out of action by an unexpected enemy.
And I must have been there a couple of weeks because I just don't remember.
He was knocked out of the fight, not by a bullet from a Japanese gun or shrapnel from a mortar blast, but by the bite of a mosquito. George Kugel contracted the deadly virus, dengue fever. As George lay on his deathbed, gripped with fever, the U.S. island hopping campaign continued in earnest, along with some of the fiercest fighting in the Pacific yet. Okinawa. Today, though, those memories can wait until these veterans can finally see the memorial inspired by their experiences. High school students from towns across Kansas are with the men, there to share in the moment. It's what they've been waiting for. This is the final act in the story of their sacrifice in World War II.
I'm just real grateful that I could be here to do that.
Where did you serve?
In the Navy, I was in Saipan, Okinawa, in South Pacific.
Okinawa. My grandfather was in Okinawa.
Really?
It is well up in my throat. It just takes your breath away.
It's not hard to imagine how fortunate these men feel. Each battle would test the mettle of their convictions. And one battle more than any other. The battle for Okinawa would be next.
The island of Okinawa was 350 miles from Japan. You know what I mean? We're on Okinawa. A stone's throw from Tokyo.
It would be even more deadly than Saipan or Iwo Jima. And the fighting started while the men were still on their ships. That's when the kamikazes began their terrifying reign.
Oh, at Okinawa, many more kamikaze there. See, the thing is the kamikaze boys, it's not that far between one island and the other. So they had range to come in and make their attack, and kamikaze, this is do or die.
And all they could do was to try and shoot them down before they hit their target.
And we would defend ourselves. We had a 5-inch gun on our ship, and we had anti-aircraft turrets. We had 4 of them on our ship, and they were very busy.
Lee witnessed the terror with his own eyes.
One kamikaze plane, and it was, fortunately, a hit was scored that caused it to veer off and land, 75 yards or a little more beyond the bow of our ship because it veered off. And so that was a very scary moment. We then came into the reality of knowing what could happen.
These were the original suicide bombers. The psychological effect was even more devastating than the actual damage. But it gave men like Lee Phelps on targeted ships insight to an enemy they could not fully understand.
I think that there wasn't a person aboard ship that didn't have the same feeling that I did. How can a person be so dedicated that they would fly out there and make this attempt of sinking a ship, doing all the damage you can to your opponent, with the idea that your life is at an end?
On Okinawa alone, nearly 1,500 Japanese planes zeroed in on at least 30 U.S. warships, killing or wounding almost 10,000 Americans. But even as the skies swarmed with enemy aircraft, Marines never lost a beat as they prepared for the ground offensive.
But the same thing was prevalent there as it was at Iwo Jima, in the tunnels and the fortresses, the capability to where they're defending the island.
Okinawa would be hard, but soldiers like Lee Phelps and E.J. Novotny knew that staring down the challenge here was still only a prelude to what they thought would be the final act. A full-scale invasion of mainland Japan. It must have been daunting.
You didn't know you were in constant fear and you were in harm's way. You know, you didn't know when the next one would be here.
Okinawa was the largest amphibious U.S. attack in the history of World War II. Over 500,000 Americans faced off against 100,000 Japanese. But the enemy's will to fight to the last man more than made up for their disparate numbers.
You were thinking, this is a real thing.
And just getting ashore meant advancing through a kind of horror few can imagine. And like the kamikazes that terrorized Phelps on ship, inland bombing raids would terrorize men like E.J. to great effect.
When the siren went off, then we could see the glare of the big searchlight on this plane. They called them washing machine Charlies because the motors sound like a washing machine. And they'd bomb.
At night, lying in his canvas tent, E.J. would hear the plane, then the whistle of a bomb drop, and wonder if this was his time to die.
But there was 87 bombing raids in that period of 87 days.
In a twist of macabre irony, E.J. would take refuge in a nearby Japanese graveyard in the concrete tombs when the raids would start.
And that's when we guys would go and hide in those places where they had the urns of the dead. Hide in there. So practically every night that washing machine Charlie would come over. Rather nerve-wracking. Yeah, but you got used to it. You know, when you're younger, the fear is not like it is when you're older. The fear is there, but you're exposed to it. Well, I was scared, don't get me wrong. Scared to death. But it's a different type of fear.
By late spring of 1945, the war in Europe has ended, and FDR has died. But the battle for Okinawa drags on. It would last for 4 months, and the losses were staggering. Over 12,000 Marines killed, and nearly 40,000 wounded by battle's end in June 1945. But in the waning days of the battle, the island became less fearful for E.J. And the Okinawans, an ethnically distinct island people, who for decades were victims of Japanese tyranny, became less fearful of Americans.
And we give chocolate to the little ones. just like they did in Europe. And the little ones that always come to us, and for chocolates and little handouts. And they were always friendly to us.
These men joined the fight for the same reason, for country and freedom. But it didn't make their journey any easier. Most men signed up for 4-year terms, or the end of the war, whichever came first. And by 1945, most had seen their fair share.
You thought about family, you thought about your parents, and you cried. Yeah, that's normal. And that's what kept you going. Yeah.
In most cases, letters were their only link back home, and each looked forward to the days when mail would arrive.
Novotny, they'd holler out, you go sit by a tree under the shade and read your mail. It was, well, did you get some candy today? Hey, come on, let's open it up now. And they'd divide with you when they got a box of cookies or what have you. Yeah, that was what you waited on. That helped you. Boy, if you hadn't had that, somebody to back you up and give you support, there's no telling what had happened.
E.J. Novotny had that link home, and it would be greatly needed, because even though the battle for Okinawa was over, winning the war meant taking the fight to mainland Japan. George Kugel fought for weeks to stay alive after contracting dengue fever. And his fight wasn't a lone battle. An alarming number of soldiers fell victim to one disease or another, rivaling the numbers of men injured by the enemy. George had earned enough points for a stateside furlough and a transfer to Quantico.
They had a point system that they had started up, and if you had so many points, well, then you got to return to the States. They gave us 30-day leave, and that's when my wife and I were married on the 24th of January.
The Pacific was done with George Kugel. The men from Kansas, like men from every corner of the country, had many different wartime experiences.
This memorial is put up for what we fought for.
And a single memorial can't possibly encapsulate the experiences of the millions of veterans who fought. But today, it's helped bring their memories alive.
When these World War II veterans came home, they never came home and banged their chest. They never bragged about what they did, what they accomplished, out of respect for all their friends that they lost, the real heroes that never made it home. It's important to them, as humble as they are, to share their accomplishments, to share their experiences with other people who will know, hopefully, for all eternity, what they did, what they accomplished, and what their friends sacrificed.
By the summer of 1945, the war was nearing an end. Both sides knew it. E.J. was still on Okinawa, George stateside, and Lee was somewhere in the Pacific. Then, on August 6, 1945, the shocking news came. A single bomb had destroyed the city of Hiroshima. Everyone, everywhere, held their breath. Could this be the end of the war? Then, 3 days later, On September 2nd, 1945, Japan officially and unconditionally surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major foreign powers.
Within hours of the surrender, Lee Phelps' ship had received her next orders. In some respects, it would be one of the most difficult voyages of Lee Phelps' career. The mission, to go upriver to what was left of Nagasaki. Lee managed to snap several photos of the dead city, seen here for the first time.
When we came in, we arrived at the mouth of the river early in the morning. I would call it break of day. And as we went up the river, well, you'd see the shrines along the river. We didn't see people.
Little was known about the lingering effects of radioactivity, and Lee had no idea how dangerous it really was, except for the obvious devastation.
We knew that it had been bombed, and we did not realize the tremendous damage, obliteration really. It just evaporated.
And the devastation Lee witnessed was overwhelming.
It's hard to believe. You could look clear across beyond the few little buildings right around the docks. There was nothing except there was a brick building. I guesstimate myself, probably 5 to 7 miles away. As you would look at it, let's say it's a level land, and then there's a slight mountain there, and there's a large brick building. And that was the only structure. It had been damaged, but it's the only standing structure that we could see, as far as our eye could see. So it was a shock.
In time, the atomic bombings would become controversial in some quarters. But to these veterans, there is no controversy. The bomb ended the war. For E.J. Novotny, still on Okinawa, it meant he could finally go home.
When that happened, when the war ended, boy, you talk about it shooting up in the air, and, everybody was thrilled to death.
If the bomb hadn't been dropped, the thought of continued fighting to E.J. and the thousands of other men was inescapable.
If the war hadn't have ended, the guys from Europe would have come over here in the Pacific, and we would have invaded Japan. We'd have went full pack to them.
An invasion of Japan would have likely involved each of these men into 1946, and possibly beyond.
And a lot of us would have never came back. Thousands of us would have never came back.
Well, we were happy to see it happen, even though it was a disaster, a tragedy, really. But with the men that I was associated with aboard ship, it was eliminate the Japs in the conflict so we could go home.
The war was over. The boys are headed home.
When I seen my name on that bulletin board, and unbelievable. To know you were going home, safe. And boy, that Golden Gate, boy, was a beautiful thing.
Glad to see it over. A lot of men were lost. Glad to get home.
These men were lucky. They made it home alive.
I just looked back and God looked after me. Many lives were lost.
And the loss of human life was beyond comprehension. Roughly 72 million people, military and civilian, perished. It was undoubtedly the deadliest conflict ever in human history. The toll of war got to Lee Phelps. He believes in war there are no real winners.
I hate war. No one wins it, even though people say they won the war. Everyone loses. And I knew I had to be there for a purpose and a need, but it didn't make me love it.
As their visit to the memorial comes to an end, it's easy to reminisce about World War II in terms of the glory days. A war with a clear objective and a decisive victory. But these men know what the real cost of war is, and what and whom they were fighting for.
The World War II veterans come out here for two main reasons. Reason number one is to see how this nation is going to remember their accomplishments. Reason number two is they want to know how their friends are going to be remembered. Their buddy that never made it out of the plane or off the ship or onto the beach. How will this nation remember that ultimate sacrifice paid by their friend that was beside them on the battlefield? That's why they come out here.
Back on the tarmac at Salina, Kansas, a surprise. It's a celebration, a welcome home. In New York and D.C., there were ticker tape parades, but not for the men who served in the Pacific.
I thought that every World War II veteran, when they came home, they had the ticker tape parade through New York. No, they were occupation forces. They came home 6 months, 9 months. They came home a year after the war was over with. There were no parades.
Today, these men of the greatest generation, got the thank you they well deserved.
You don't have a heart if you don't know how to be humble and recognize what's been sacrificed for me and you and those to follow as Americans.